All right, with no other sightings, we'll get going with our program this evening. We are happy to welcome back Laura Erickson to be with us once again. We love hearing from you, Laura, and all the different adventures you have, including the adventure of your radio spot and all the work that goes in behind that in the past programs that we've had with you. Um, you're a Duluth legend and a local treasure, so we're happy that you're one of us here and happy to welcome you with us today to talk about birding in Alaska.
Well, thanks. I'm going to share my screen and there. Um, my trip to Alaska actually is directly related to my 50th anniversary. It was at March 18th, 1972 that we got married, and we had to find some way to celebrate. Um, Russ, my husband, is the one who gave me my first pair of binoculars, and we actually have a picture of me holding binoculars for the first time in my life. So, and that outfit is exactly like one that Suzanne Plachette wore once on the Bob Newhart show. So that puts you in the right frame of time. For our, when we turned 50, I bought us a cruise on Alaska's Inside Passage on this small ship. It was owned at the time by a Native American company, and they were following all kinds of really responsible procedures for minimizing their environmental footprint. So we went on this cruise in 2001, and that's the only time I've been to Alaska. But we decided, well, now instead of being 50, we just turned 70 and we had our 50th anniversary. So we decided this was our 50th anniversary of our first date. 3 years ago. So, but anyway, so we decided to go to Alaska, and we decided to do it as a Victor Emmanuel nature tour, partly because I wanted to go to Nome, which when I get to the part about Nome, it wasn't a place I wanted just the two of us to have to figure out on our own. And there was a big reason was that Eric Brunke was one of the co-leaders, and he's been sort of our emergency auxiliary backup son for a long time. So on the pre-trip, the Nome trip, we had 114 species, and 10 of them were lifers. The rest of the tour was actually longer, but we saw fewer species, 109. It was like 160 some total, and only one of those was a lifer. So it's because a lot of their birds in especially around Denali. Some of them you might as well be in Minnesota, but we'll talk about that too. So before I go on any trip, I always have to study up and I read the Birder's Guide to it, whatever the ABA has put out for that state. So I can check all the places we're going to go and get a sense of what they're going to be like. And I do that whether I'm going on a tour with other people guiding it or whether we're on our own. Alaska, there's this great book, The Arctic Guide, and a lot of the animals, we didn't see a single bear and we didn't see a single wolf, so don't get too excited. But we didn't see a single lynx or bobcat. But we saw a lot of other really cool things. And this is a really cool book that talks not just about the animals, but the plants. So it was worth getting. I study up using eBird. You can go to different locations in the eBird Explore data, and they'll generate these wonderful checklists showing you how abundant a particular species is from month to month so that you can study up and know what you're likely to see. And also, if you're going, even if you're going on your own, it's worth looking at the websites of tour companies that go to that area because you can read their field reports. The one that they generated from our trip is online for anybody to look up what we saw when and where. So it's pretty cool. So then you have to fly, and we flew through Minneapolis. That's where we met up with Eric, and they have interesting art there. We were on our way. Yeah, Eric's our backup boy. We went to Anchorage, and in their airport, they have a different kind of airport art. That was pretty cool, even though it wasn't very alive, but neither was Snoopy when you think about it. So, but we went to Anchorage first, and second, well, first, third, fifth, and seventh. We started out in Anchorage. Russ and I got there a day before most of the people on the tour got there. We met the second evening and birded on our own a little bit. But then we flew to Nome. Then we came back to Anchorage. And then we went up to Denali. Then we went back to Anchorage. And then we went down to Seward. And so we were staying at the Holiday Inn Express near the airport, and they have a storage room. So if you brought a big suitcase because you needed to have, bulky, heavy boots for Nome, and then you didn't need them anymore or stuff like that, you could leave them in the storage room in between all our stays. So it was really a cool idea that I hadn't thought much about. Um, but Anchorage was a really cool place to start out and spend time birding. If you're going to Denali, you can, I think it's a little shorter to stay in Fairbanks, but Anchorage is way closer to Seward. So if you want to do both of those, Anchorage is the good central location. The first day we got there, Russ and I both realized we'd forgotten important things, so we decided to walk from our hotel by the airport all the way to REI, which was 3.5 miles away, and back. And that's the only time on our whole trip that we saw a snowshoe hare. So go figure. But all the seagulls in Anchorage are short-billed gulls, which we used to call mew gulls. So if you've already seen a mew gull, it won't be a lifer. But now they were separated from the common gull of Europe, and so now they're the short-billed gull. And right by our hotel, when we got back from walking 7 miles and had lunch, then we decided to go birding. And there's a seaplane base that was just like a quarter mile from our hotel. So we went there, and we went there at the very end of the trip too. We flew out in the evening after our final night. So we had a whole day to kill, so we could sleep in and then go birding. And we went back to Fort Hood. But so this is where we were getting our first taste of Alaska birds other than gulls, with redneck grebes. A lot of them are like what we see here, black-billed magpie. You can see those in the bog. But red-throated loons were pretty amazing. I didn't see red-throated loons at Fort Hood actually until our last day, and that's a whole nother story. But boy, they were pretty amazing when we finally saw them. The group in the morning, our flight was at mid-morning. And and some of the people were not going to be coming back and birding again in Anchorage. So they took us for a quick stop at the Westchester Lagoon, which is a really worthwhile place to go if you find yourself in Anchorage. There were baby short-billed gulls. They were nesting. There were nesting redneck grebes. Everything was cool. And there were golden crowned sparrows just about everywhere we went, but some of them were more tamer and more interested in being photographed than others. There's another huge marsh in just on the outskirts of Anchorage called Potter Marsh. And boy, was that wonderful. This is a bull moose, and we were very close, but we were totally safe because we were on a boardwalk which was raised looking down on him, and he was used to people being on the boardwalk and couldn't get up there anyway. So that was a pretty cool experience. That's where we first saw Doll sheep, was just a little bit down the road, as if you were going south to go to Seward. And those are comparable to the bighorn sheep, except they don't have such big horns. Arctic terns were everywhere, and they were so beautiful. and it was so fun. And then just birding places around town in between our other trips. We had families of three-toed woodpeckers, families of spruce grouse. This is the mama, and she crossed the road with the baby, and there were several of them in trees, including we could actually watch them eating spruce needles and little bugs in the trees. They were so adorable. And as long as I've lived in Minnesota and as much as I love spruce grouse, this is the only time I've ever seen babies. So I was very thrilled. Then we flew to Nome that at mid morning that day, and we had several um, uh, target birds, and this is where I really, really, really wanted to go. We flew on Alaska Airlines from Anchorage to Nome, and that's where the Iditarod sled dog race ends. It begins in Anchorage, but we didn't see where it began, but we saw where it ended. We got out of the airplane. Eric and Barry, our other leader, went off to get the vans, and we looked up, and on the wire right there outside the building of the airport, overlooking the parking lot, was a white wagtail. Now, this was not a lifer for me because I've seen them in Europe, but it was a lifer for Eric, and he and Barry got back, and the bird was gone. And they finally saw one on another day that the rest of the group missed. But we all got the white wagtail before Barry and Eric. When you go, okay, there were no, we were there right at the peak of a bad um, uh, number of positives for COVID in Nome. It was really bad. And some of the restaurants were closed. None of them were serving breakfast at all. And the only one serving lunch was Subway. And that window at the Subway is overlooking the Bering Sea. It was a really cool subway to be in. Plus, the walls were rumbling. Do you know why? That is also Nome's movie theater. And they were showing Jurassic Park. But so it was really fun. We picked up lunches there before we went out every morning. We picked up lunches. We'd ordered them the night before. And so we all had lunches to eat in the vans because there was nowhere to eat anyway, and you want to stay going. Okay, right that first afternoon after we ate at the subway, we went just a little bit, not very many miles, and had our Aleutian terns. They were really cool. And we had bar-tailed godwits. Those were both lifers for me. And we had Arctic warblers. And at mile 15, we had our first blue throats. And that was my most wanted bird of the trip. So I was pretty thrilled to get it the first day. We also saw musk oxen. They were actually wiped out. And the musk oxen in the Nome area are reintroduced animals. And so many of them are tagged on their ears. Right at the mouth of the Nome River, we had a really amazingly cooperative thick-billed mirror. That was one of my other really wanted lifers. I'm not going to tell you which of the roads we went on. We've been asked not to tell people, but we had not just a gyrfalcon, that wouldn't have been that notable, but their babies. And they were as cute as peregrine falcon babies, so that was pretty cool. There are 3 roads that lead out of Nome. None of them go anywhere big. But there's just 3 roads, and they're extremely remote. And this is why I wouldn't have felt comfortable just Russ and me going. I wouldn't have known where you rent a vehicle that you could be sure would bring you not just out, but back again. So this was the main reason I wanted to go on a tour. The Nome Teller Road was the first one. If you're looking here, that's the one, the further east one or west one. And that's where we had blue throats, willow ptarmigans, rock ptarmigans, including, do you see the female here on her nest? Here's her eye. Oops. Oops. How am I going backward? There. Her eye is right hidden in here. And it was just so cool seeing all these cool things. This is a Pacific golden plover. This was the only place we had them, was in Nome. The black-bellied plovers were nesting. Long-tailed Jaegers were everywhere. Here, they're the rarest of the three Jaegers that we can see on Lake Superior, but there they were everywhere. And we did have one day in Nome where we had all three Jaeger species, though the long-tailed were the only ones who were really cooperative for having their pictures taken. We had a northern wheat ear, which I'd already seen in Duluth once at 40th Avenue West. Here's where we had our Subway lunch on the tundra. It was really cool. Then the next day we did the Nome Council Road, and that's the road that goes along the shore a little bit, so and to the mouth of the Nome River and stuff. That's where the last checkpoint of the Iditarod is at the Safety, that's the name of the town, Roadhouse. This is the only place we had Eastern yellow wagtail, and that was a lifer for me. I'd seen the Western in Europe, but this is more the Asian one. And you literally come to the end of the road. There's actually a native village a little beyond us, but you couldn't get there except through the on a stream. So that's where the road ended, and you just turn back and drive back to Nome. But on that section where it follows the water, that's where we got our only look at an Arctic loon, as different from a Pacific loon. And red-throated loon, this nest was right next to the road. It's not the crispest picture because it was out the van window, but it was right next to the road. There's an Asian scoter called that was separated just a few years ago called Stegneger's scoter, and we picked one out, and I'm 99% sure that the bird on the left is the Stegneger's that we all saw clearly through the scope, but it was a line of scoters, and I'm pretty sure that's the one that was the Stegneger's. Then our third day was the big road, the one that people go to Nome to see the bristle-thighed curlew if they don't feel like going to Hawaii and just looking at some of the golf courses where they can see them in winter. This is where they breed. And we only went as far up this road as this number 12. It was an online site that was telling you places on the road to go, but we only, that was milepost 72, so it's pretty remote, and it's once you get to those hills that is where the bristle-thighed curlews nest. And we were told it can take hours, and many groups don't see it at all, and you have to go up this hill that is not too steep, but it's all uphill, and it's wet and yucky. And once you get to the top, you're in all these just clusters of tundra vegetation that are really hard to get around and through. So they told us all kinds of stuff, and two of the people just stayed back at the vans. They didn't even want to deal with any of that. But we that was what our big physical stamina day was supposed to be. And here's how remote it was. It was just beautiful, but you know, there's no cell phone and things like that. Beautiful American golden plovers there. Notice that the white ends at the neck instead of going down the sides a bit like it does on the Pacific. That's one of the ways you can tell them apart. And here were people coming down the hill looking very discouraged. they saw some birds up there, but they weren't sure if they were the bristle-thighed curlews or whimbrels, and they felt very discouraged. They hadn't studied the vocalizations because you really do. If you're going to go to all the trouble to do a long hike to see a bird, it's a really good plan to know what it is that you're looking for. So study your calls if you're going to try and do this. So here we are getting ready. Eric and I were wearing rubber boots. Russ bought some expensive over boots for his that cost a whole lot of money, where I was just wearing my cheap old lacrosse rubber boots. And we were getting ready to go up, and you have to climb until you get to the crest. And we were 12 minutes hiking. We were still in plain view of the vans, and they flew right over. This is my picture. They were like amazing. And it wasn't quite as easy photographing them where they landed, because we didn't keep hiking up toward them because they were going to be, somewhere where they were nesting. But hokey smokes, that was pretty cool. So the anticipation of physical endurance vastly exceeded the actual event. And here I'd really been working out for months ahead of time so I would not be the last person up that hill. So here's a reenactment of us spotting the first bird. It was actually after I'd taken the picture when they'd come down to earth. So he's pretending he's pointing up, but here's where we saw the bristle-thighed curlew well before we got to the top. And here's our group, the whole group at the end. It was just those 3 full days in Nome. And the next day we flew back to Anchorage, and then we headed up to Denali. And that was really cool. My first view of Denali was actually from the airplane when we were flying to Nome. And I looked out the window, and there it was sticking up above the clouds. And I luckily took a picture because we did not see Denali when we drove up to Denali. We did see Denali, but it was when we were coming back. The best place to see Denali is at the McKinley View Lodge. It's well named, except Denali was shrouded in clouds. But I was not even looking for Denali. And the reason for that was because these guys, violet green swallows, were all over the place. It was one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And so I told Russ what I wanted for lunch, and I stayed out there while he ordered and waited, and everybody else was talking or looking out the window. And all I was doing is taking pictures of violet green swallows. I'd never gotten a picture before. I've seen them many times, but this was so thrilling. So I was in heaven at the McKinley View place. On our way up to Denali, we saw this lovely moose family. Moose were the mammal du jour up where we were. Moose have been increasing wonderfully in Alaska, and that's actually kind of tragic. It's not that the moose are increasing that is making the caribou disappear. What's happening is the permafrost is melting, and we're getting many more of the kinds of plants moose browse on, and way less of the genuine tundra plants that caribou need. But oh, it was glorious seeing all these moose. They were just, and most of them were like this cow. They had twins, meaning they were older cows, and they were having good reproduction. If you ever go to Denali, it is totally worth it to take the bus tour and take the longest one, the all-day one. It could not, the visitor center in Denali is closed right now. One of the roads, they talk about a landslide, and you think of all this junk over the roads that they can't clear off. No, the landslide was the road. It collapsed because the permafrost melted that the road was atop. And so there is no road. They are working out ways of figuring out how to open it up again somehow to get vehicles to their visitor center. But so we were on this bus, and we were on vans for the Victor Emmanuel group, but the windows did not open except for the driver and the guy sitting shotgun. And when I say the guy sitting shotgun, it was just about always a man, and it was just about always the same man who hogged that seat. So but these windows opened. We had a wonderful guide. He was a bird watcher too, but most of the people on this were not interested in birds. They were interested in mammals and scenery, and so were we. But we did get some wonderful looks at a few birds, and we got to see more doll sheep up there on the mountain, and we got to see more moose, and we had these screens in the bus. It was like on an airplane. They had those in the bus. Only the driver had to move the camera to what he wanted us to see. But it was just as easy to look out the window because the caribou were right there, and it was just amazing. The female caribou also have antlers, so you can't tell if it's male or female by its having antlers, but this one is a female. And there was one really nice place where we looked over. So Eric took this picture. And here I'm taking a picture of a willow ptarmigan right next to the bus. And it was just like so cool. And also, this is the only place we saw an Arctic ground squirrel, and that was a very cooperative little critter from right outside my window. That night after we got back, we went looking for northern hawkowl. We were there on the equinox, and we're not in the Arctic Circle, so it wasn't a 24-hour light, but nobody was ever awake when it was dark because it was a very brief time in the middle of the night. So it didn't matter when you went out, the birds were active. And this is a northern hawkowl and a ruby crowned kinglet, saying every little tiny, tiny ruby crowned kinglet swear word you could imagine at that. And varied thrushes, must have been nesting in the tree right next to this because they were just going ballistic about this northern hawkowl. We had semi-palmated plovers nesting right on the road. It was amazing. So they were very cooperative for pictures. Now look at the yellow-rumped warbler. I've always figured the myrtle warblers are the east ones and the Audubons are the western ones, but it doesn't work quite like that. These pictures I took in Alaska, but look at the ranges. When you get to Alaska, it's all the myrtle warblers. They go all the way across. It's the Audubons, the quote western ones, are in the west, but it's further south. It's in more the plains and the lower Rocky Mountains. So it was cool that all my yellow-rumped warblers were myrtle warblers. Lesser yellowlegs, I took this right. We were just pulled over on the side of the road, looking at the semi-palmated plovers, and here was a lesser yellowlegs. This was right. We stayed at Denali Village, and I would not recommend staying there. All the rooms were by big bus stops and stuff. It was this huge complex. It was very comfortable, but it actually, some of the time, I could smell the fumes from the buses from our room. So that sort of sucked. But Eric had a boreal chickadee family from the parking lot. I took this in the parking lot. So there were cool things. And boreal chickadees were the chickadee we saw the most of, and they were feeding babies, so it was very cool. And white-crowned sparrows were everywhere, and blackpoll warblers. And we finally did see Denali the day we were going back to Anchorage, so that was really thrilling. And then we went down to Seward. After another day in Anchorage, we went down to Seward. And that was where I got my last lifer of the trip. But it was by far the single coolest day of the trip was the day we took a boat trip. And I cannot recommend the long boat trip to Kenai Fjords National Park more highly. If you're ever down in Seward, do that. We drove down, Anchorage is up here, and we had to go through here. This particular body of water is where there is an endangered population of beluga whales, but we didn't spot one. And then you just keep driving down to Seward, which is way down there. Okay. And on our way, we stopped at the Alpine Bakery because Eric and Barry said that was the greatest blueberry fritters in the known universe. And oh, they were good. But I didn't even go inside. I let Russ buy mine because I was out watching the northwestern crows, which have been lumped with American crows. Barry was totally angry that they'd lumped it with American crows. They are so different from our crows that you can they have to be two different species, right? Except they grade from from the northernmost Alaskan ones down through till you get to Washington and Oregon, and it's a gradation, and genetically it's the same species. So, but they were really cool to see, and very sweet and curious, and they were like my backyard crows. People must feed them. As a matter of fact, one of the women who worked at the subway in that little strip mall handed me some peanuts to feed this one because she brings them to work every day to feed the crows. But so they were very, very sweet. Um, in Seward itself, we saw long-billed song sparrows, which look totally different from our song sparrows. But again, it's that gradation, and genetically, it's the same species as our song sparrows. And they have the sooty fox sparrows there. And again, that looks way different than the fox sparrows I get in my backyard, but it's the same species. They have Townsend's warblers. We'd actually seen them on the drive to Denali, too. They're such pretty Western warblers. And Steller's jays, and they were just very cool and cooperative for pictures. And this is where we got the chestnut back chickadees. They were not found in the inland parts, they're more coastal and, just like they are in the wet rainforest type things when you get down in Washington. But they were adorable. But any chickadee is adorable. We did see quite a few black-capped chickadees too, but I figured you'd already seen them. This was the only picture I got of the only hummingbird that nests up in Alaska, a rufous hummingbird that comes to one feeder in Seward that all the bird tour groups go to. And birders who are not on the tour know about the feeding station too. So then we took our boat trip. We started out at Seward, and the boat went through into some of these fjords and to get to Kenai Fjords National Park. One of the National Park visitor centers is actually in Seward. And you're going to see puffins when you're going out the harbor, and there's a mural like that on the biggest building. And that was my biggest desire. Neither of the puffins of the West would be a lifer for me. I've seen the tufted puffin all the way down as far as Oregon and California, and I'd seen the horned puffin when Russ and I took that cruise. The last day, the farthest up we got on the Inside Passage, I finally saw one or two horned puffins. But this is also the scenery everywhere was so gorgeous, but it was amazing on the boat. And look how still the water is. We so lucked out. So we got to get closer in to some of the places where the seabirds were nesting and some of the places where the glaciers were calving because the water was extraordinarily calm. It was just an amazing day. There was virtually no wind either. And it was just stunning and cool. And we started out watching humpbacked whales doing their bubble net fishing, which was so cool. These are mostly glaucous winged gulls that are capitalizing on it. It's a baleen whale, and their throat, the only food that can get down their gullet, has to be smaller than a grapefruit. They cannot swallow big fish. And they go for these schooling little fish like herring and just little fish, and when they come up into a school, the fish are in their mouth, the water gushes out, and if there's a big fish in there, they can spit it out. But it was so cool watching this. Along the side, we could see black-legged kittiwakes and glaucous winged gulls nesting and pooping. We could see both common and thick-billed murres. And it was a little tricky to pick out the thick-billed murres, but here they are. They have that white marking along their beak that was kind of distinctive. If they have the little line behind the eyes, some common murres have that. That's not them. The thick-billed had that cool white little mark. Pelagic cormorants were the main cormorants we saw. Here I finally got a picture. Oh, I didn't mark it with an arrow, but the red-faced cormorant. That's the only time I've ever gotten a picture. I saw a few nesting when we were doing the Inside Passage cruise, but they've declined greatly. And this is the only one we saw on this trip. But they were nesting in with kittiwakes and common murres. This was my one lifer of the trip. I so wanted parakeet auklet, and we saw several little groups like this. This is the only picture I got of one swimming, but I was thrilled about that. Tufted puffins were very common. And they're so funky and cool looking. And these were my best pictures of them ever. But what I really wanted pictures of was the horned puffin. I just am so taken with them. They're called horned because they have this big projection above their eye. Atlantic puffins have a projection too, but it isn't that long. So they call this the horned puffin. And they were just so cool to see. And we saw a few mammals too. Harbor seals were all over the place, and stellar sea lions. And sea otters were very, very skittish around the tour boats. So this is at a distance. But that's the only place we saw mountain goats. And she was one of the crew people who actually fished that chunk of ice out of the water, and they used a hammer to break it up to make the ice to make margaritas, and oh, it was good. So, and you of course have to wait and eat all the ice because it's just, when do you get to eat glacier ice that you actually saw the glacier? And he's the guy who made that, and he's also the one who told me he was the one who was supposed to stock the what do they call it, the junk you buy to bring home to give your grandchild, and he had forgotten to bring stuffed puffins on this trip. And I wanted to get one for Walter, my grandson. So he told me which gift shop to look for them at. And here's Eric. You can tell he's been drinking his margarita happily. And my husband, who doesn't drink, so he was focused on beautiful other things. It was just so spectacular and cool. And then we got to see the orcas. And that was the coolest thing of all, I think, as far as mammals go. And this is my favorite picture of the orcas because look who's flying above them, a horned puffin. So I was in heaven. And that night was the only night that Victor Emmanuel, our dinners were provided. But they also, that was the only night they provided the drinks. And this is a blueberry mojito. And oh, it was good. But that's the only day of the trip I had any drink at all. And I had two. So I was tired. So we went back after dinner. We didn't wait for dessert. And at the restaurant, everybody else saw a whole group of like 7 river otters right on the pier next to the restaurant. So don't have two drinks if you go up to Alaska. A cautionary tale. The next morning, we did some low key birding around town and we saw this little family of moose. And we saw a cute little snipe and another curious Townsend's warbler. We got our best looks at dippers. Um, and then we had our last night and our checklist and everything. And then everybody went home either that night after dinner or early in the morning. And Russ and I were around, so we went back to Fort Hood. And that's when I saw this amazing red-throated loon right near shore, right at near the end of a pier that was one of the ones that they use for getting on and off seaplanes. So I start walking down the pier with my camera straight on the bird, and I'm like so excited. And all of a sudden, the ground dropped out from under me, and I crashed because it was a 2 level pier. And I had to notice there was a step, and my camera smashed onto it, and the lens hood popped off into the water, and I'm on a blood thinner, and I hit my knee really hard, and I actually think I broke my finger. I hurt it really bad. But hokey smokes, I looked up, and that's when I got this picture after I fell. My camera was fine, though it didn't have the lens hood on. Russ fished that out of the water. Everything was fine. Um, when I finally thought to take off my wedding ring, and I still can't get it on because the finger's still a little too swollen, but it took over a half hour to get it off with icing my finger because my finger swelled up like a sausage. But I survived and got my best pictures because of it. And once I reassured my doctor that A, I did not hit my head, I would have gone to the emergency room if I'd actually hit my head, but that it was not an old lady fall. I did not get dizzy or one of my bones crumble or anything. It was just a crazy bird photographer fall. He was fine about it. And so then we sat around. Russ was doing actual work. This is my screensaver with my daughter and Walter and his bird stamp book. But notice the nutritious food I'm focused on eating this last day before our airplane flight: Cheetos and a Coke. And okay, but we also, while we were still in Seward, went to that gift shop. We'd already bought Moosey at in Denali at a gift shop, but every friggin' puffin I could find was an Atlantic puffin. Here we are in Alaska, which has those two wonderful puffins, and they had the big accurate mural of them right there, and they're selling uh, ones that are Atlantic puffins. And the way you can tell that is the horn puffin, see, that's yellow here, and the Atlantic puffin, it's gray, and Puffy is gray, and plus he does have the big long extension, the horn. But so I decided his name was Puffy the Magic Puffin because he managed to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And he's Walter's favorite little guy now. So we've taken walks all around his neighborhood with him holding Puffy. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of going on a birding tour rather than going on your own? When you go on a birding tour, and it could be one of Kim Eckert's MOU week things, or it could be Victor Emmanuel, it could be like Wisconsin Society for Ornithology every now and then arranges tours to Costa Rica or different places. And if you're on one of those tours, you don't have to plan out anything. It's all planned out for you. When you get up, where you eat, how you get places. It's really cool because you don't have to think about it. You don't have to select hotels. You don't have to worry about which ones could have bed bugs or anything. You don't have to look for restaurants. They already know the best places and which ones are open when. Someone else does all the driving. And when you looked at some of those roads outside of Nome, that was a really cool thing to have someone else be driving them. Many places are safer when you're in a group. Sometimes it's because of crime, but sometimes it's because of remoteness, especially when you're my age and you've already had 2 heart attacks. You want people around that can maybe help you if you need it. Guides know all the best birding spots because they've been there many times before. They keep abreast of exactly where the rarities are. They lug their own spotting scopes and make sure everybody gets looks. And they point out birds that might be hiding in vegetation that I can't hear anymore, even with my hearing aids. So those are all really big advantages. They know the best strategies for maximizing the number of birds you see. I might know I want to go to this spot to see the blue throat, but not know about the spots on the way where I'll be able to see other birds. Um, and birding companies often get first crack at making reservations when you want to stay when you want to go to a blind to see Gunnison sage grouse, or when you want to take a boat trip. They get they make the reservations a long time in advance. And then just birding with Eric, that was a big pro for us. The cons, it's very expensive. We, not counting what we paid for our flight to and from Anchorage, um, and not counting the extra night we stayed the first night, it was 9,790 each for us. And it would have been more if we were traveling alone and didn't have a roommate. And that is expensive. We never would have forked out that kind of money for anything if we weren't celebrating our 50th anniversary. It's way more than we'd have to pay if we were doing it on our own. And it's way more than we'd pay if someone like Kim Eckert was putting together a program to those exact same places, because he knows how to economize on them. It's impossible to make field sound recordings when you're with a big group. It just doesn't work. Um, and I brought my Zoom recorder and microphones, but they were never. And too many of the best photo ops were through the window, and the windows didn't open. And that was very frustrating. And there wasn't enough time for photographing some of the birds I wanted to spend time with that were not going to be lifers for anybody, and other people weren't that interested in. You can't take a day off now and then just because you're in this perfect spot at Denali or in Seward and you just want to go bird watching by yourself and rest. You can't get away with that. And uh, they spent way more time at dinner time at restaurants and a few places at lunch, when I would have rather been out birding. So, and if you're easily irritated by people, going with a big group can be a problem. And there are a few people, I'm probably one of them, who are irritating because they want things their way. But we had a jolly good time. It was totally worth it. And that is the end. So I don't know if there's time for questions. There's time for me.
There's definitely time for questions. Does anybody have any?
I forgot what you said. What were the dates that you were there in Alaska?
Oh, I don't remember. It was like June 11th to
June.
26th or something. It was including the equinox.
Okay. For 2 weeks?
Yeah, a little, just like a day over 2 weeks.
Uh-huh. Thank
My
you.
daughter and son-in-law had to provide their own child care for 2 weeks.
We have one question in the chat box, and that is, what camera and lens do you use?
Oh, I spent my family's entire discretionary income um, uh, a year ago to buy the Canon R5, which is a mirrorless camera. It finds the bird's eyeball and focuses on it, which is mind blowing to me, but it works. And I use the lens that goes to that. They're 100 to 500. And I don't think I'm ever going to think about buying another camera, but they were obscenely expensive, cheaper than the trip, but still really expensive. And but I just absolutely love them. And they're the camera's 45 megapixels, and the megapixels are really good because, you know, when you get a bird picture, a lot of times the bird is little and you have to crop around it, but with 45 megapixels you still end up with a pretty big picture. And you find my Flickr photos if you go to flickr.com. It's Flickr, there's no E.com, / one word, Laura Erickson. And that'll be my Flickr photo stream. If you want to cut to the chase because you want to see what pictures I've taken of the bristle-thighed curlew or that really exciting bird that I focus on more than anything, the black-capped chickadee, go to lauraerickson.com, my webpage, and where it says search species, put in whatever bird you're curious about, and it will link to all my Flickr photos of that species, and also any radio programs where I talked about it, and if I've made any field recordings and stuff like that. Oh, but Jeff, you put in my link to that.
I did.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I think I have to say a kind word for my husband. This was our anniversary, not my anniversary. And Russ is not a birder. And but he loved the trip. But I think he would have preferred at least occasionally to be able to wind down a little bit, you know, because it's pretty intense. Um, Somehow, to me, it was really cool. I was worried about maybe it might be too intense for me too. And I did skip one optional evening trip. Russ skipped a couple of optional morning trips too. But when we went to that Westchester Lagoon the first day in Anchorage, I went, but Russ stayed back to get us all our luggage ready for going to Nome. But yeah, he really took one for the team. He loved Denali. Oh, he loved the boat trip. Well, it was a great time, but it really was something he would not have picked out if he was the one calling the shots.
Anybody else?
It was it was fun being up in Denali, feeling like I was up in the Saxon bog. You know, the ravens and boreal chickadees, and you know, it had a very nice feeling of home. But then there were those ptarmigans and
Any final questions before we say goodnight?
if you think of anything, you can just email me.
Well, thank you, Laura, for sharing your adventure with us. As you mentioned, I mean, because of the remoteness and the distance and the cost of such an adventure, you know, it's great to be brought into it by your program tonight. So thank you much.
Thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you.
As for the rest of you,
Thank you, Laura.
Remember our Tuesday morning walks in September and join us out at Park Point at the Search for Migrants this fall.
Great.
Have a jolly good migration. I'll be
Jolly good.
leading Park Point trips for Hawk Ridge on Saturday and Sunday of Hawk Ridge weekend, by the way.
And I co-guide one on Saturday morning at the Western Waterfront Trail.
Ooh, cool.
All right. Well, good night, everybody, and see you soon and be well.
Sleep
Thank
tight.
you. Thank
Good
you.
night. Thank you.
Good night.